I had just narrowly escaped death after a heart attack when my son stood right there in the intensive care unit, not holding my hand, not asking whether I was still in pain, but directly asking the doctor when I would be lucid enough to sign the paperwork. And when I heard him tell his wife, if he won't sign, just put him in a nursing home and be done with it, I understood that I was no longer a father. I had become a risk that needed to be handled neatly. The humiliation wasn't in the hospital bill of $68,000 or in the fact that I had to sell my vintage car in the middle of the night just to manage. But in the moment, I realized they had already discussed how to manage my life right in front of me, using a calm voice like they were arranging an old piece of furniture. And if you've ever been reduced in that cold way, ever been turned into a burden simply for still being alive, stay until the end. Leave a... And tell me where you're listening to this story from and whether you want to keep hearing stories where justice isn't loud, doesn't need spectacle, but is cold and precise enough to make those who once looked down on others pay the price. I value your companionship. I woke up at 4:17 in the morning because of an extraordinary sensation. Not sharp pain right away, but a heavy force pressing across my chest, like someone had placed a full sack of wet cement on my rib cage and was standing there without moving. My breath shortened. Air entered my lungs, but not deeply enough. Sweat seeped down the back of my neck, even though outside, Milwaukee was bitterly cold. I sat up on the edge of the bed, both feet touching the cold wooden floor. My heart beat irregularly. Some beats faltered, others rushed, as if trying to make up for something that had just slipped away. 68 years old, I was used to back pain, used to my knees crackling every time I stood up, but this feeling was different. It didn't feel like fatigue. It felt like a warning. I reached for the phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up, clearly showing 3:18 in the morning. I dialed my son's number, Daniel. My fingers trembled slightly, but I still pressed each digit correctly. The phone rang, once, then twice. No one answered. I inhaled again, more slowly, then called back. Still, Daniel. I thought maybe he was asleep. I waited a few more seconds, then switched to Laura's number, his wife. My daughter-in-law always woke up early, at least before 7, to take the kids to school. The phone rang, this time longer. Then it stopped. No automatic reply. No familiar voice on the other end asking, "Dad, what's wrong?" Just a very clean, very decisive silence, as if those two calls had never existed at all. My chest tightened again, this time not only because of my heart. I put the phone down, planted both hands on my knees, and bent forward to catch my breath. In that moment, I thought very quickly, so quickly that even I was surprised. If I collapsed onto the floor right now, how long would it take before anyone knew? I had been living alone for 3 years, since the day Mary, my wife, died of pancreatic cancer. This house in the Bayview neighborhood was one I had built with my own hands from the foundation up 40 years ago. I knew every beam, every section of pipe. But no matter how solid a house is, it cannot answer the phone for you. I picked the phone up again, this time calling Megan, my daughter. I remembered her voice clearly from Sunday, when she said the whole family was busy, that it wasn't convenient to stop by, and told me to take care of my health. The phone rang, then silence. 3 calls, 3 empty spaces. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen. Every step felt heavy, not because my legs hurt, but because my heart felt like it was pulling my entire body backward. I poured water, but my hand slipped, and the glass hit the edge of the sink with a dry clack. Water spilled onto the counter, running into a thin stream. I leaned against the refrigerator and slid down to the floor. My breathing had become rapid. My forehead burned, yet my mind was frighteningly clear. I remembered every detail: the pale yellow kitchen light, the steady ticking of the wall clock, the old flannel shirt Mary used to wash for me, hanging behind the door. 40 years earlier, I had started as a laborer on a road construction site on the outskirts of town. The pay was low, the hours irregular, but I never missed a shift. I learned how to read blueprints, how to pour concrete so it wouldn't form air pockets, how to stand in rain and snow and still keep pace. I spent my entire life building things that did not bear my name. Roads for the city, houses for others, a future for my children. I remembered late nights coming home, my hands still crusted with dried cement, Daniel asleep on the sofa, Megan curled up in her blanket. Mary used to say, "You work this hard so our children won't have to suffer later." I believe that. I never thought there would come a day when I would have to call them in an emergency and receive no answer. The pain spread from my chest to my left arm, dull at first, then sharp. I knew I should not hesitate. I crawled toward the table and reached for the phone again. This time I did not call my children. I called 911. The dispatcher's voice came through clearly, calm. I was able to say my name, my address, and that I was short of breath and had chest pain. I heard knocking at the door just a few minutes later, but to me that stretch of time felt as long as an entire morning. 2 paramedics lifted me onto a stretcher. The ambulance lights were blindingly white. One of them asked if there was a family member they should contact. I repeated Daniel's number. The other person called. I stared up at the ceiling of the vehicle, counting each vibration. There was no answer on the other end of the line. In the emergency room, everything happened quickly and efficiently. Electrodes were placed on my chest. Machines emitted short, steady sounds. A doctor leaned over me, his voice firm, saying I was having an acute myocardial infarction. They would intervene immediately. When I woke up in the intensive care unit, it was already daylight. Sunlight streamed through a narrow window and fell directly onto the white tile floor. A middle-aged doctor stood beside the bed, reviewed the chart, then looked at me. "You're lucky," he said. "If the ambulance had arrived 15 minutes later, we wouldn't have made it." I nodded. My throat was dry and raw. I asked a very simple question, one I had held on to since opening my eyes. "Has anyone from my family come?" The doctor glanced at his notes, then gently shook his head. No explanation was needed. That shake was clear enough. I turned my face toward the window. Outside, the city was beginning the new day. Cars moved along, people went to work, to school, living their lives, and I lay there with 3 unanswered calls and a truth that had just come into sharp focus. In the moment I needed them most, the people I had spent my entire life protecting were not on the other end of the line. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to memorize this feeling, every detail of it, because I understood that from that moment on, something had cracked, and once a foundation is cracked, sooner or later, the entire structure reveals its truth. I fully regained consciousness after the procedure late in the morning. The heaviness in my chest had eased, replaced by a dull exhaustion spreading through my body as if someone had wrung all the strength out of me. My left arm was immobilized, an IV line hanging beside the bed, dripping steadily. The intensive care room was bright and clean, with the faint smell of disinfectant in the air. A nurse came in, checked the monitor, and then asked whether I wanted to call a family member. I nodded. She handed me the phone and carefully adjusted the pillow behind my back. I dialed Daniel's number once more, this time in a different state of mind. There was no vague hope left, just one final test. The phone rang, then stopped. No one answered. The nurse looked at me with sympathy. She did not ask anything further. She gently took the phone back, told me to rest, and said that the finance department would come by later, discuss some paperwork. In the early afternoon, a man wearing a light-colored shirt with a hospital name badge stepped into the room. He pulled up a chair and sat across from my bed, his voice clearly trained to be polite, yet firm. "Mr. Hale," he said, "we need to discuss the cost of your treatment." He placed a stack of papers on the rolling table by my bed and flipped to the first page so I could see it easily. The bold number sat right in the center, $68,700. I stared at it for quite a while, not because I was shocked, but because I wanted to understand every part of that number. The man began to explain. The interventional equipment used in my procedure was considered out of network. That portion was not fully covered. On top of that was the annual deductible I had not yet met. Various smaller charges added up, each one minor on its own, enough together to push the total to that amount. He spoke slowly and clearly, like someone reading out a construction estimate. I was familiar with that tone. I nodded. Everything had its justification on paper. "We have contacted the family members listed in your file," he continued, "but we haven't received a response." I let out a long breath and then asked directly, "What happens if I can't pay right away?" He answered in a neutral voice that the hospital would need a financial commitment. That could be a family member's guarantor signature or a temporary installment agreement. No one mentioned refusing treatment anymore. The surgery was already done, but what came after still required someone to take responsibility. The afternoon passed slowly. I lay there watching the light move across the wall, thinking about how I would speak to my children. Not to ask for money. I only needed them to sign as guarantors so everything could be handled properly. That evening, Daniel and Laura finally appeared. They walked into the room with hurried expressions, as if they had stopped by on their way home. Laura carried a large handbag. Daniel glanced at the equipment around my bed, and then checked his watch. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice flat. "The doctor says I'm stable," I replied. "I need to talk for a bit." I handed him the papers. Daniel took them, flipped through a few pages, and stopped at the final number. His eyebrows drew together. "Why is it so much?" he asked. I repeated what the finance department had explained. I added nothing and complained about nothing. I simply laid out the situation exactly as it was. Daniel set the papers down and leaned back in his chair. Laura crossed her arms and looked at me with a guarded expression. "You have insurance," Laura said. "How did it end up like this?" "I do," I replied, "but the equipment was out of network." Daniel was silent for a few seconds. Then he spoke, slowly, as if he had considered it carefully. "You can handle it yourself. You have savings. We're carrying a lot already." I looked straight at him. "I'm not asking you to pay for it. I just need a guarantor's signature so the hospital can process everything." Laura cut in immediately. "You have to understand us. We have a house, young kids, and loans. Signing medical paperwork like this is very complicated. What if something comes up later?" Her words landed softly, but I heard every single one. "So what are you saying?" I asked. Daniel exhaled as if he were the most exhausted person in the room. "I mean, you should figure it out yourself. This is your matter." I sat still. My heart had just been saved, but in that moment, something else felt as though it was being crushed. "It's just a confirmation signature," I said again more slowly, "not a transfer of money." Laura shook her head. "Dad, we can't get involved in medical costs like this. It sounds very risky." Daniel nodded along. "You're older now. If you decide on financial matters yourself, then you bear the responsibility yourself." I looked at the two of them standing in front of me. I remembered the days when Daniel was little, when I stood at construction sites in the middle of winter, sending tuition money home on time. I remembered the times Laura called, asking to borrow money for the down payment on their first apartment, and I transferred it the same day, without asking for contracts or paperwork. I placed my hand on the stack of bills and slid it back toward myself. "All right," I said. "I understand." Daniel stood up as if a burden had been lifted. Laura glanced around the room once more and said they had to leave early to watch the kids. Before walking out, Daniel turned back and said one sentence I will never forget. "Dad, please understand. This matter, you're not worth us signing our names." The door closed behind them. The room returned to silence. The heart monitor continued its steady, indifferent beeping. I lay there staring at the stark white ceiling. The number 68,700 was still clear in my mind, but what hurt most was not the money. It was the fact that after nearly 40 years of being the family's pillar, when all I needed was a signature, I had become a risk that my own children want to avoid. I closed my eyes, not to rest. I was telling myself something very simple. From this moment on, I would not ask for help again, and whatever happened after that would no longer be a matter of chance. I was discharged after 4 days of observation. The doctor gave me very thorough instructions, handing me a thick stack of papers covering everything from medication to daily routines. I nodded, signed my name, and followed every step the way someone who has lived an entire life, by discipline, would. But when I reached the payment counter, the number $68,700 was still there, cold and unchanged. The hospital offered me a temporary arrangement: pay a portion up front to complete the discharge process and handle the remainder later. The deposit required was $12,000, payable within 24 hours. I listened without arguing. I asked only one question: can I pay in cash? The staff member nodded. On the way home, I drove my 1969 Chevy C10 more slowly than usual. The engine ran smoothly, the familiar sound coming from under the hood, a sound that had been with me for more than 30 years. I had bought this truck from a welder in the suburbs in 1988, when Daniel was just turning 6. I had taken it apart piece by piece, repainted the body, and replaced the entire electrical system with my own hands. Every scratch in the paint had its own story. I parked in front of my house and sat there for a long time. My mind was unusually clear then. Everything was laid out cleanly, with no room left for emotion to interfere. I needed cash that very night, not because I was broke, but because most of what I still had was locked away. Long-term accounts, property documents, assets that could not be liquidated quickly without leaving a trace. I needed something that could be turned into money immediately, without extra signatures, without explanations to anyone. I knew a small garage in South Milwaukee, about a 10-minute drive from my house. The owner was named Frank Miller, a man I had known since my construction days. Frank was not wealthy. His shop had only 2 lifts, an old tin roof, and the smell of motor oil clinging to everything. But Frank had a reputation for keeping his word. I started the engine again and turned the truck around. The streets were sparse at night, yellow streetlights reflecting off the damp pavement. My heart was still weak, and every gear change required extra care, but I had no other choice. Frank was locking up when he saw me. He frowned, looked at the Chevy, then at me, and his expression immediately shifted to concern. "Robert, you're driving this late?" Frank asked. "I need to talk," I replied, shutting off the engine. 5 minutes. Frank reopened the shop and turned on the lights. The white light fell over the truck, making the old blue paint gleam faintly. He walked a slow circle around it without touching it, just looking. "I need to sell it," I said plainly. "Tonight." Frank turned back and stared at me for a long moment. "What's going on?" "I just got out of the hospital. I need cash urgently." Frank exhaled and pulled out a chair for me. He did not ask anything else. He recognized that tone. Anyone who had worked construction long enough knew when words were a decision, not a complaint. "I can't pay market value," Frank said. "I only have about $12,000 in the safe." I nodded. I had already calculated that number. My Chevy, sold properly at the right time, could fetch 30, even 40,000. But I did not have time to list it, nor the strength to wait for offers. "That's fine," I said. "Cash is all I need." Frank frowned. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Frank opened the safe and counted the money carefully. He placed the stack on the table and slid it toward me. Before I could take it, he said something that made me pause. "Robert, I'll hold the truck for you." I looked at him. "What do you mean, hold it?" "I'm buying it," Frank said. "I'll do the title transfer in my name. But this truck isn't for resale. When you're better, when you're able to buy it back, you come talk to me. I'll keep it as is." I gave a dry smile. "That's a bad business deal for you." Frank waved it off. "A man's word. Besides, you're not a stranger." We completed the paperwork quickly. I signed my name, Frank signed his. No lengthy contracts, just enough to make everything legal. When it was done, I stood up, stepped outside, and looked at the Chevy one last time under the shop lights. Frank covered it with a tarp, pulling the edges carefully like he was protecting something valuable. "I'll watch it," he said. I took the money and slipped it into my jacket pocket. My hands trembled slightly, whether from my heart or the cold, I couldn't tell. On the way home, I took a taxi. Through the window, I saw closed storefronts and quiet streets. I thought about Daniel, about Laura, about the words spoken in the hospital room. When I got home, I placed the stack of cash on the kitchen table and counted it again. Enough. I exhaled for the first time that day, feeling my heartbeat slow just a little. That night, I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling. I had sold a piece of my memory to buy 24 hours of safety, but I also knew that the truck had not truly left my hands. Frank had planted a seed with his promise, and I had a very clear feeling that one day that seed would return, not just as a truck, but as an answer to what my family chose on the night I needed them most. I went back to the hospital 2 days after being discharged for a follow-up. The doctor wanted to check how my heart was responding to the new medication and told me to take it slow and avoid stress. I listened, but at that time there was only one thing on my mind: finishing the financial paperwork so I wouldn't have to come back to this place again. While I was sitting in the waiting room, my jacket draped loosely over my shoulders, a strange woman walked up. She wore a gray suit, held a rigid file folder, and had the kind of eyes used to reading other people's names on paper more than looking straight at their faces. "Mr. Robert Hale," she asked. I nodded. "Please accept these papers." She handed me a thick envelope, carefully sealed. I looked at the printed line on the front before opening it: Milwaukee County Court. My heart gave a small jolt, not the pain like last time, but a cold feeling running down my spine. "What is this?" I asked. "An emergency guardianship petition," she replied briefly. "My only duty is to serve it." She turned and walked away immediately, leaving me sitting in the middle of a crowded waiting room, holding a stack of papers whose meaning I had not yet fully grasped. I moved to a quieter corner, sat down, and opened the envelope. The first page appeared clearly, coldly, fully stamped. A petition for emergency conservatorship. Petitioners: Daniel Hale and Megan Hale. Proposed ward: Robert Hale. I read each line slowly. Every sentence was written in a very confident tone, as if the writer was certain they were right. They said I show signs of cognitive decline. They listed unusual financial decisions in recent days: selling a vintage vehicle below market value, paying medical expenses without family consultation, handling my assets without transparency. I turned to the next page, a description of my health condition presented as a conclusion already finalized: myocardial infarction, advanced age, living alone, easily influenced, in need of protection. At the bottom of the page I saw my son's signature, a familiar handwriting, not shaky, not hesitant. Beneath it was my daughter's signature, 2 names I had taught to write when they were small. I closed the file, my hand gripping the edge of the paper tightly. No one in the waiting room knew what I was holding. To them, I was just an old man recovering from illness, sitting quietly waiting for my turn. But inside that envelope, my life had been placed on the scale without my consent. I read on, this time more carefully. What an emergency conservatorship petition meant, I understood very well. I had worked with the city government and had read plenty of legal files in infrastructure projects. Once the court approved it, the appointed conservator would have the right to control bank accounts, assets, and even decide where I lived and whether I was allowed to sign documents myself. In other words, with just a temporary ruling, I would become someone who had to ask permission to live my own life. I looked at the filing date, 3 days earlier. At that time, I had still been lying in the intensive care unit, an IV still attached to my arm, not even able to walk a full lap of the hallway. They had filed it while I still couldn't stand steadily on my own. My throat went dry. Not from fear, but because I had just realized that everything before this had not been a spur-of-the-moment reaction. It was a plan. That evening, Daniel and Laura did not come to visit me. Megan didn't either. But they had managed to sit down with a lawyer, prepare paperwork, and write line after line describing me as someone no longer lucid enough to decide my own fate. I folded the file back up and slipped it into my bag. When the nurse called my name into the exam room, I stood, walked slowly, but each step was steady. The doctor asked how I was feeling. I answered truthfully. My heart was better, but my mind was not. After the appointment, I did not go straight home. I stopped by a small coffee shop near the hospital and ordered a hot black coffee. I needed to sit down, needed to think clearly. I pulled the file out again and reread it from beginning to end. In the attachments, there was a medical certification. The doctor's name was printed clearly, and the signature looked neat. I looked closely. Something didn't match. I didn't remember meeting this person. Throughout my hospital stay, I had worked with only 2 primary doctors, and neither of them had that name. A small detail, but enough to make me stop. I understood that from this moment, the story had shifted into a different phase. This was no longer about my children refusing to help or avoiding responsibility. This was them actively trying to strip my rights, using the law as a tool. I put the file back in my bag and finished the coffee after it had gone cold. When I stood to leave the shop, I no longer felt lightheaded like I had that morning. Instead, there was a very cold clarity. They thought I was weak. They thought that because I had just gone through a heart attack, I would panic, give in, and sign anything just to have peace. They didn't understand that I had lived my entire life among projects where one small mistake could make everything collapse, and if they had chosen to strike me while I hadn't even recovered yet, then I would remember that day very carefully, because from here on out, I would not only protect myself, I would let the truth reveal itself, step by step, at the right time, in the right place. Daniel called me the following afternoon. His voice sounded gentle, deliberately trying to make everything feel normal. "Come over for dinner tonight, Dad," he said. "The whole family wants to have a proper talk." I understood very clearly what the phrase, "a proper talk," meant. It wasn't an invitation. It was a notice. I stayed silent for a few seconds, and then agreed, not because I wanted that dinner, but because I needed to hear what they would say when they believed they held the power. Daniel's house was in Wauwatosa, a 2-story home they had bought 4 years earlier. I had put up the down payment, and personally guaranteed part of the loan. The first time I stepped into that house, I still remembered fixing the stair handrail, because the contractor had done a sloppy job. That evening, when I parked in front of the gate, the dining room lights were already on. The smell of food drifted outside, familiar yet distant. Laura opened the door. She smiled, a smile clearly prepared in advance. "Come in, Dad," she said, her voice higher than usual. Daniel stood behind her, one hand resting on his eldest Teason's shoulder. The boy looked at me and greeted me softly. The 2 younger children were in the living room, eyes fixed on the television. No one stood up. The dining table was neatly set. There was plenty of food, many dishes, like an important occasion. I sat down at the chair at the end of the table. Daniel sat across from me, Laura beside him. The seat at the head of the table, where I used to sit whenever I visited, was left unmentioned. The meal began with polite questions. "Are you feeling better?" "Is the medication working?" I answered briefly. The atmosphere seemed calm, but I could clearly feel the tension just beneath the surface. When the children finished eating and ran upstairs, Daniel put down his knife and fork. He looked straight at me, his tone turning serious. "Dad," he said, "we've talked it over." Laura nodded, her hands clasped together on the table. I waited. "After what just happened," Daniel continued, "we think you need someone to help manage the important matters." I asked calmly, "Manage what matters?" Finances, paperwork, major decisions, Laura answered for him. You've been through something serious. We're worried you're not as clear-headed as before. The words were spoken very lightly, but with intention. I looked at Laura, then at Daniel. I can still pay my own bills, I said. I still go to my own appointments. I still signed my own discharge papers. Daniel waved his hand. That's not the point. The issue is risk. I raised an eyebrow. What risk? Risk to the family, Laura said. If you make a bad decision, we're the ones who end up carrying it. Daniel nodded. To be blunt, Dad, you're a liability right now. The word landed in the middle of the dinner table, clear and unvarnished. I could hear the clock in the kitchen ticking. Liability, I repeated. A potential burden, Daniel explained, as if presenting to a client. You're no longer working. Fixed income. Your health is what it is. If something comes up, the responsibility still falls on us. I gave a thin smile. I've never made you cover a single debt for me. Laura leaned forward. Not yet, but it could happen. We just want to be proactive. Daniel pulled a stack of papers from beside him and placed it on the table. I recognized immediately that it was a copy of the conservatorship petition. He didn't open it, just left it there like an exhibit. Don't think of this as taking away your rights, Daniel said. It's just restructuring things. We'll help you make decisions so everything stays safe. I looked at the papers, then at my two children. In that moment, I remembered the days when Daniel was little, when I taught him how to balance on a bicycle. I ran behind him, hands ready to catch him, but I didn't hold on because I wanted him to ride on his own. Now he was no longer speaking to me as a father. Daniel's voice sounded exactly like the way he spoke to business partners, precise, cold, and distant. In my mind, a very clear image appeared, one I had never considered before, me being pushed into the back seat, the seatbelt already fastened, the steering wheel in someone else's hands, someone who would decide where I went, when I stopped, and when I would be considered an inconvenience. I turned my head toward the staircase where the children had just run upstairs after dinner, then turned back and looked straight at Daniel and Laura. Do you say these things in front of your children without thinking about how they'll see their grandfather? I asked, my voice not raised, but slow enough for every word to land on the dinner table. Daniel paused. He avoided my eyes and answered a few seconds later, They're still young. I nodded, keeping my tone even, not needing to raise it. So you discuss controlling me, discuss signing papers, discuss transferring authority, right here in this house, while your children are still here, and yet you don't think about the fact that they're learning how to look at their own grandfather. Laura cut in immediately, her voice sharper, as if to stop the conversation from going any further. This is an adult matter. I looked straight at her. Yes, it is an adult matter, I said slowly. But you let children witness their grandfather being talked about as a risk that needs to be handled. When you do that, it stops being just an adult matter. It becomes the way you teach your children that one day, the people who gave them life can be set aside for convenience. I placed my hand on the table, keeping my voice steady. I worked for 40 years and signed hundreds of contracts. I know when a conversation is help and when it is control. Daniel exhaled. You're overreacting. No, I replied. I'm listening very clearly. Laura turned to Daniel. Go on. Daniel looked at me, his eyes hardening. You need to understand your position now. We'll handle the assets and accounts. You just need to sign these papers. In return, we'll make sure you're taken care of. I asked one final question. And if I don't sign? No one answered right away. Laura pressed her lips together. Daniel spoke after a few seconds. Then we'll let the court decide. That sentence dropped onto the dinner table like a full stop. I stood up. The chair scraped softly against the floor. I looked at Daniel, then at Laura. Thank you for dinner, I said. But from now on, don't call this management. Call it by its real name. Daniel frowned. What name? Control, I answered. And this dinner is the last time you speak to me as if I were a child. I walked toward the door. Laura called after me, her voice raised. Dad, don't make this hard for us. I turned back and looked straight at them. You chose to make it hard for me first. Outside, the air was cool. I took a long breath. That dinner left no taste of food in my mouth, but it left something else, clearer than ever. They no longer saw me as a father. They saw me as a file that needed to be processed. And from that moment on, I knew I could not remain silent. If they had chosen to humiliate me inside the very house whose foundation I once helped build, then what came next would no longer be a family matter. It would be a matter of accountability, and this time I would not let anyone manage my life for me. I left Daniel's house when it was fully dark. There was no loud argument, no need for further explanations. What lingered after that dinner was a very clear feeling. They had begun to see me as a problem to be managed, not a father to be respected. I drove straight home, turned off my phone, and left every message unanswered. That night, I slept very little. What filled my mind was not anger, but a question that kept repeating itself. If I did nothing, how far would this go? The next morning, I called Ethan Brooks. Ethan was not the kind of family lawyer who appears on television. His office was on the second floor of an old building near the Milwaukee County Courthouse, with worn wooden stairs, narrow hallways, and the smell of paper and stale coffee. I chose Ethan because he had handled several property disputes for friends of mine in the construction trade, cases that were quiet, but with very clear outcomes. When I walked in, Ethan was sitting behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, his tie draped over the back of a chair. He looked at me, gave a single nod, and gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down," he said. "You don't call this early unless it's serious." What struck me immediately was that Ethan did not ask who I was, did not ask my age, and did not use a sympathetic tone. He opened his notebook, took out a pen, and waited for me to speak. I placed the stack of papers Daniel had brought the day before on the desk, the emergency conservatorship petition. Ethan flipped to the first page and read slowly. His eyes moved steadily, without expression. I sat still and let him read everything. About 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up. "They're asking for control over your finances and medical decision-making," he said flatly. "If the court grants this, you won't be able to sign contracts, withdraw money, or even make your own treatment decisions." I asked directly, "Can they really do that?" Ethan nodded without trying to scare me. "Legally, yes, but it isn't easy. Emergency conservatorship is only approved when there's evidence that the person lacks capacity immediately and poses a danger." He flipped to the attachments. "This is the key part." Ethan pointed to the medical affidavit. They submitted a doctor's statement claiming cognitive decline and abnormal financial behavior. I swallowed. "They're using the fact that I sold the truck." "Yes," Ethan replied. "But selling an asset during a medical emergency is not automatically a sign of incapacity. The court isn't that naive." He paused and leaned closer to the page. I saw his eyebrows tighten slightly. "When did you see this doctor?" I answered immediately. "I never saw him after the procedure. Even then, it was a different doctor." Ethan said nothing more, simply opened a drawer and took out a thin file. He compared two signatures side by side, one from an older record, one from the newly submitted affidavit. "Look," Ethan said, turning the paper toward me. "This signature tries to imitate, but the slant is different. The stopping points are different. This is a very typical sign." I felt my heart beat faster, not from fear, but because something was coming into focus. "You mean—" "Let's not jump to conclusions yet," Ethan cut me off, his voice firm. "But if a doctor never examined you and still issued a statement, this goes far beyond a family dispute." He leaned back in his chair. "When a medical affidavit is falsified and submitted to the court, that's no longer a civil matter. It can be a felony." I fell silent. In my mind, I saw Daniel sitting at the dinner table the night before, speaking smoothly and calmly, as if everything had already been arranged. They hadn't just planned to manage me, they had prepared a file. Ethan looked at me, his expression changing for the first time. "I'll ask you plainly," he said. Do you want to stop them, or do you want to counterattack? I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window at the streets of Milwaukee during rush hour, people moving busily through their lives. I thought about 40 years of work, about my house, my land, and every decision I had ever made without needing anyone's permission. I don't want to make a spectacle, I said slowly, but I also won't accept someone else holding the steering wheel of my life. Ethan nodded. Then we moved step by step. First, I'll verify the doctor. Appointment records, insurance files, every trace. If there's fraud, they'll be the ones explaining themselves in court. He closed the file. From now on, don't sign anything they give you. Don't meet them alone. And most importantly, don't let them think you're panicking. I stood up, feeling very different from when I had walked in. Still worried, but with direction. As I reached for the door handle, Ethan added one more sentence, his voice low but clear. They made a mistake thinking that someone who has lived his whole life by contracts and signatures wouldn't recognize the smell of forgery. I nodded and stepped into the hallway. In that moment, I understood that last night's dinner was only the opening move. They had chosen the rules of the game, and I had just begun to understand them. I went back to Ethan's office that same afternoon, not to ask for more law, but to hear everything he needed to say before it was too late. Ethan closed the door, drew the blinds, then placed his phone face down on the desk, the habit of someone used to handling matters not meant for outside ears. You have two options, Ethan said plainly. One is to object immediately and file with the court. The other is to wait. I didn't like the word wait, but I also understood that some battles are not won by charging first. Wait for what? I asked. Wait for them to expose themselves, Ethan replied. Court is not where a story opens. It's where it ends. He pointed to the lines in the conservatorship petition. They're building a picture of you as someone who has lost financial control. If you react too early, they'll pull back, clean up the file. I began to understand. So, let them think I'm unraveling. Ethan nodded. Not actually unraveling, just looking like it. He was very clear with his instructions. I was allowed to worry, allowed to ask the same questions repeatedly, allowed to appear uncertain, but absolutely no signing, no transferring authority, no handing over money, only talk, and let them grow used to deciding for me with words. That night, I began. Near midnight, when the house was quiet, I sent Daniel a message, deliberately leaving the wording loose, like someone thinking out loud. I keep wondering, the money from selling the Chevy the other day, will it be enough to cover the remaining hospital bills? Or did I rush the sale and still come up short? Just minutes later, Daniel replied, Dad, don't try to handle those things yourself anymore. Let us deal with the money. The more you worry, the more confused you get. I reread that message several times. It didn't say they would pay. It didn't say they had helped. It simply removed me from the position of decision maker. Over the next few days, I continued the role. I called Daniel, asked questions I had already asked, apologized for forgetting. I mentioned the hospital bill with just enough anxiety in my voice. I let them see me leaning on them in words. In return, they spoke more. Daniel began talking about long-term plans. Laura talked about needing to manage Dad for safety. The phrases sounded polite, but gradually took on the tone used for someone who no longer fully owned his own life. One evening, when I brought up the hospital bill again, Laura sighed and let it slip, her voice like she was offering gentle advice. She glanced up toward the stairs where the kids were watching television and said, You worrying this much only makes the kids more anxious. They see their grandpa stressed all the time. I looked up at her. That was the first time the children had been used as a reason. Not my health, not money, my grandchildren. I didn't ask which child. I didn't ask who had said anything to them. I stayed silent, and that silence left Laura's words hanging in the room, exposing their true nature, using the children's names to shut me up, while no one had ever asked what the children actually thought. Over the weekend, Daniel sent me a draft he called a care agreement. Not signed, just for me to read and get used to. I opened it and read slowly. The language was soft, but the meaning was very clear. Decision-making authority belonged to them. I called back, letting my voice shake more than usual. I read it, but I don't understand. That's okay, Daniel said. We'll explain it slowly. When? I asked. Next week, he replied, at a law office. I hung up and sat still for a long time. They had taken another step, not to court, to the place they believed was safest for them. That night, I called Ethan. After listening, he said only one sentence, his voice firm. They're building their own stage. I looked around my house. Every wall I had built with my own hands, every mark of a lifetime of work, I understood. I would step onto that stage, exactly in the role they expected to see. Until the lights came on, everything began to change through very small details. So small that if I hadn't been fully alert, I might have wondered whether I was imagining things. That afternoon, Daniel called me, his voice gentler than usual, the kind that tries to sound caring. This weekend we'll come by to help clean the house for you, Dad. You've been tired lately, and you living alone like that worries us. I stayed silent for a few seconds, then replied, All right, if you're free, come by. I knew this wasn't an offer. It was a notice. Saturday morning, they arrived fairly early. Daniel came in first. Laura followed, carrying a few bags. The children came too, but they didn't run around like usual. They sat quietly on the couch, looking around as if they had been instructed beforehand to observe something. You just sit and rest, Laura said gently. We'll take care of it. I sat in my familiar chair by the window, watching them move around the house I had lived in for more than 30 years. At first, everything looked normal. Daniel gathered old newspapers. Laura wiped the table. But before long, the rhythm changed. Stacks of papers I had neatly arranged were separated and spread out. The living room drawers were pulled open and left that way. A jacket I usually hung neatly was draped over the back of a chair. A half-finished cup of coffee was moved to a different spot, right at the edge of the table. I stood up. I'll do it myself. Daniel turned and smiled lightly. Just sit, Dad. Let us see how you usually keep things. The sentence sounded harmless, but it made me pause. See how. Around late morning, Laura took out her phone. She said she was calling her mother, but I noticed the camera was on. It wasn't pointed directly, just angled on the bookshelf, enough to capture the entire living room. I asked, What are you recording? Laura answered quickly, Oh, just some family moments, for the kids to look at later. I said nothing more. I began to understand that the stage was being set. Daniel went out to the front yard and spoke with a neighbor. I caught fragments of his words. My dad's been pretty weak lately. He forgets things. We have to come by more often. His voice was just loud enough for others to hear, just soft enough to sound like private concern. When I stepped onto the porch, a few glances turned my way. Not curious, but pitying. The kind of look from people who think they are witnessing something sad but necessary. A neighbor asked, Is Mr. Hale doing okay? Daniel answered for me, He's managing old age, you know. I stood there right in front of my own house, but my words were no longer being waited for. Back inside the living room, Laura deliberately asked me very specific questions. Quickly, where do you keep the insurance papers? Do you still remember your bank password? Do you remember what you ate yesterday? I answered fully. Some questions took me a moment to think about, and every time I hesitated, Laura glanced toward the phone, where the camera was still running. After a while, she said to Daniel, as if casually, See, Dad gets mixed up about these things. I looked around the room. Everything now no longer felt like my house. It felt like a place that had been rummaged through deliberately. Messy just enough to look uncontrolled, but not so much as to be obvious. The children sat quietly on the couch, unusually silent. From time to time, Laura turned to them and said, Come look where Grandpa puts his keys." They looked, then looked at me, their expressions awkward. When Daniel suggested taking a family photo so everyone's included, I knew the first act of the performance was complete. In the picture, I sat in the middle, my back slightly hunched, clutter around me, open drawers visible behind the bookshelf, a perfect frame to tell a story very different from the truth. When they left, the house fell silent again. I stood alone in the living room, looking at each item placed out of order. I didn't clean up right away. I sat down, took out a notebook, and wrote everything down. The time they arrived, where the camera was placed, what Daniel said to the neighbors, what questions Laura asked. I wasn't angry. I felt cold. They didn't need to hit me or raise their voices. They only needed to turn the house I had lived in my entire life into evidence against me and let others look on with pity. That evening I called Ethan. I said only one sentence. "They've started staging the scene." Ethan was silent for a few seconds, then replied, "Good. The more carefully they build it, the more it will hurt when it collapses." I hung up and looked around the house again, this time with different eyes. This was no longer just where I lived. It had become a crime scene, and I knew that from that moment on, every step they took inside this house would come with a price. After the morning when my house had been turned into a stage, I didn't clean up right away. I left everything exactly as they had arranged it, like an unfinished photograph. I needed that feeling to cling to me a little longer, so that when I spoke, my voice would naturally carry the fatigue they wanted to hear. It wasn't until the afternoon that I picked up the phone. I waited until night fell, when people are more easily softened and more willing to believe weakness. I sat down in the old chair by the dining table, lowered my shoulders, and slowed my breathing for a few steady beats. I didn't need to act much. A day like that was enough to genuinely wear a person down. Daniel answered fairly quickly. "Dad?" I let a few seconds pass before replying as if searching for breath. "Yeah, it's Dad." "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice cautious. I swallowed. "I'm tired." On the other end there was a brief silence. Then Daniel softened his tone. "Tired of what?" "Everything," I said. "The house, the paperwork. My head is a mess. I don't think I can manage anymore." I let my voice tremble just enough, not dragged out, not theatrical, just like someone who had realized his limits. Daniel didn't answer right away. I guessed he was looking over at Laura. "Don't think too much," he said. "We're taking care of it." I inhaled, making sure he could hear it. "I know, but I'm afraid of doing something wrong. Afraid of signing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing. I don't want to make things worse." "Then let us handle it," Daniel said more firmly. "Just hand it over to us." The sentence came out smoothly, like something already practiced. I stayed silent for a few beats, then said quietly, If I agree to let you step in, will those other things stop?" "Which things?" Daniel asked, though I could hear that he already understood. "The petitions, the court," I said, as if it were hard to say. Daniel exhaled. "If you cooperate, everything will be easier. We don't want to make a big deal out of this either." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah, I just want some peace." "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we'll come by and talk it through more carefully." The call ended with Daniel's voice fading. I heard the sound of the phone being set down, the scrape of a chair, but the line wasn't disconnected. At first there was only a faint rustling. I was about to hang up when Laura's voice came through on the other end, not directed at me, but at Daniel, the voice of someone who believed no one was listening anymore. "See?" she said, followed by a short laugh. "I told you. Just let him wear himself out and he'll give in." Daniel laughed, not loud, just enough to pass through the speaker. "Yeah, one call did it. He's scared now," Laura replied, her tone light, like she was talking about cleaning the house. "Tomorrow we just bring the papers for him to sign. He just wants peace now." I stood still, the phone pressed to my ear. I didn't speak. I didn't hang up either. I let them say a few more scattered things, about timing, about who would drive, before the line finally went quiet. I lowered the phone very slowly. There was no shouting in my head, no burst of anger, just one very clear feeling. I had just heard what they had never said to my face. Not concern for me, not fear that I would suffer, but waiting for me to get tired enough to let go on my own. I went back to the table, opened my notebook, and wrote down exactly every sentence I had just heard. Not one word added, not one word removed. The time, the tone, the laughter, that was no longer a feeling. That was evidence. That evening I called Ethan. I didn't explain at length. I said only one sentence. They forgot to hang up. Ethan was silent for a few seconds, then replied slowly, "That's enough." I looked up at the ceiling. That call to them was a sign of victory. To me, it was the moment everything shifted from family to file. And from that moment on, I stopped playing the role of the exhausted man. I began playing the role of the one who documents. The meeting took place 2 days after that late-night call. Daniel chose a cafe near downtown where the lighting was soft, the tables low, and the music loud enough to cover conversation. I arrived a few minutes after them. Daniel was already seated, Laura beside him. The children were not there. They wanted this conversation to be clean. I pulled out a chair and sat down, resting my hands on the table, letting just enough tremor show. Daniel noticed immediately. His expression shifted, like someone who had just caught the signal he was hoping for. "You look tired, Dad," Laura said first, her voice gentle. "Have some hot coffee. It'll help." "I didn't sleep well last night," I replied. My mind kept spinning. Daniel nodded. "That's why we wanted to talk sooner, so everything can be settled." "Settled how?" I asked. Daniel glanced at Laura for a beat, then spoke directly. "The conservatorship petition, we can withdraw it. Immediately. No court involved." I didn't answer right away. I took a sip of coffee and let the silence stretch. Laura grew restless, but Daniel maintained his composure. "In return," Laura said, "you help us resolve a few things that are stuck. Just temporarily." "How long is temporary?" I asked. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulled out a thin envelope, placed it in the middle of the table, and slid it toward me. Inside was a neatly printed cost breakdown, a few lines underlined. $620,000, he said, one time. After that, we withdraw the petition. Everything goes back to normal. I looked at the number, not to check it, but to memorize the way they said it. $620,000. Large enough to silence, specific enough to be a condition. "What is this money for?" I asked. Laura answered quickly. "Stability, long-term planning, so we don't have to keep running back and forth." "And if I don't give it?" I asked. Daniel exhaled, placed both hands on the table, his voice lowering like he was explaining a procedure everyone should understand. "Then we have to follow the proper process. You know that. When the court and doctors get involved, they'll evaluate your capacity. If they conclude you're no longer able to make your own decisions, you won't be allowed to live alone anymore." He paused for a beat, then continued, very calmly. "At that point, a nursing home will be where you're required to move, for full time. Supervision." The sentence landed lightly, like a line typed into a file. So calmly that I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the brazenness had pushed past every layer of disguise. "Which nursing home?" I asked, my voice slower. "One that's appropriate," Laura cut in, avoiding eye contact. "With nurses, schedules. On paper, that's the safest option." Safe. The word was released like a stamp pressed onto someone else's fate. No need to ask what I wanted. Just name the correct procedure. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a heavy breath at the right moment, like someone who had just realized he had reached his limit. Daniel saw it. His eyes flickered with brief satisfaction. "I just want peace," I said quietly. "But that number, it's too big." Daniel immediately softened his tone. "Think about it, Dad. One time only. In exchange for freedom. No petitions. No court." Laura added softly. You don't want the kids seeing Grandpa going in and out of places like that. I nodded very slightly. Give me time. How long? Daniel asked. One day, I said. I need to arrange things. He nodded, his satisfaction barely concealed. Tomorrow afternoon. Call me. As we stood up, Laura placed her hand on my arm and gave it a gentle squeeze. If you do the right thing, everything will be easy. I let it be. On the drive home, I drove slowly. I let every sentence settle where it belonged. 620,000 to withdraw the petition. A nursing home as the consequence if I didn't comply. Children used as leverage. When I got home, I sat in the car for a few minutes. Then I called Ethan. It's here, I said. They named their price. How much? Ethan asked. Higher, I replied. 620,000 in exchange for withdrawing the petition. Ethan was silent for a beat. That's enough to prove intent. I ended the call. For the first time since this began, every piece was in its proper place. That negotiation wasn't meant to end anything. It was the step where they pushed themselves fully into the light. Tomorrow, I would give them my answer. The next morning, I didn't call back right away. I let Daniel wait until close to noon, exactly the window when people start to feel anxious but can still maintain politeness. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the envelope from the day before again. 620,000. The number lay there, cold and still, but behind it was an entire plan they believed I had not seen through. Just before 11, I finally dialed. Have you made up your mind? Daniel asked immediately, his voice trying to sound calm. More or less, I replied, but before I decide, I want to understand one thing. What is it? He asked. I want to see where my money is going, I said. Specifically. On the other end, there was a very brief pause. I heard Laura whisper, something. Then Daniel came back, his voice softer. It's reasonable for you to worry, he said. We've already planned everything. Then let's meet, I replied, with a broker, with paperwork. I see it with my own eyes. Then I sign. Daniel agreed faster than I expected. Perhaps in his mind, this was a chance to reinforce the story they had already built. A tired, frightened old man who only needed reassurance from a few documents. The meeting was set for that afternoon at a brokerage office on the west side of the city. A low building, a simple sign, clean inside. I arrived a few minutes early. Daniel and Laura arrived later, with a man in his early 40s, gray suit, light-colored tie. This is Mark, Daniel introduced, our broker. Mark shook my hand, a practiced smile. Nice to meet you, Mr. Hale. We sat down at a small conference table. Mark opened his laptop and projected a project diagram onto the screen. The image showed a mixed-use development, commercial space on the ground floor, rental apartments above. This is the direction we're going, Daniel said. Real estate investment, stable cash flow. I looked and nodded slowly. Address? Mark read out the street name along with several figures about square footage and projected returns. I listened and memorized them without interrupting. My money, I asked. Where does it go in this? Daniel pointed to a box on the screen. Initial capital, to hold the spot. Then it gets rotated. How is the spot held? I asked. Mark answered instead. An upfront deposit to lock in the purchase right. How much is the deposit? Mark glanced at Daniel, then said, About 600,000. The number landed on the table, matching so precisely that I had to hold my breath. Laura smiled, as if that alignment proved the plan had been consistent all along. Where's the paperwork? I asked. Mark switched to another file and presented a memorandum of agreement. I took it and read slowly. The legal entity listed as the signer was neither Daniel nor Laura. It was a limited liability company I had never heard of. Who owns this company? I asked. Daniel answered quickly. The partner's side. It keeps things simple. I don't see my name, I said. You're contributing capital, Laura explained. You don't need to be listed directly. Fewer complications. I looked up at her. My money and my name isn't on it. You trust us. Daniel said, half joking, half serious. We'll handle the paperwork. I set the contract down. I need to meet the seller. Mark froze slightly. You mean the property seller? I said. I want to hear them speak. Daniel smiled faintly. You're overthinking it. Maybe, I replied, but I'm the one signing, so I want to hear it. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Mark closed the laptop, keeping his smile, but his eyes were less fluid. Laura leaned back, arms crossed. You're making this complicated, Daniel said. This is standard procedure. Standard procedure, I repeated. Then I have one more question. Daniel looked at me, more guarded now. What? If this project runs into trouble, I said. How is my money protected? Mark answered evasively. Real estate always carries risk. Is my name on the asset? I asked directly. Mark stayed silent. Daniel answered instead. Just trust us. I leaned back and looked at each of them. I trust you, which is why I'm asking carefully. I'm old. I need to see things clearly. Laura leaned toward me. Once you sign, everything's done. No need to dig deeper. I nodded slowly. All right. Daniel exhaled as if clearing a bend in the road. He turned to Mark. Send my dad the final version. I'll review it, I said, and I want another meeting with the seller, with ownership documents. I'll sign after that. Walking out to the car, Daniel stayed beside me, his voice lowered. You're putting us in a difficult position. I looked straight ahead. I just want to know where my money goes. Daniel smiled, but didn't meet my eyes. You can rest easy. That evening I went home, opened my notebook, and wrote down every detail. The company name, the project address, Mark's words, Daniel's reactions. I called Ethan. They're steering you into real estate, Ethan said after listening. A company you're not named on. A deposit that matches exactly what they demanded. What do you think? I asked. They think you're about to sign, Ethan replied, and they think they can spin it one more round. I looked out the window. Streetlights flicked on, cars passed by. I didn't feel tired. I felt clear. Today's meeting gave them a sense of control. For me, it confirmed the key point. The money was only a pretext. The goal was to bind my authority, push me away from my assets, and call it management. Tomorrow I would continue the conversation, and this time I would speak in a way that forced them to bring even more paperwork into the light. The brokerage office was on the 12th floor of a newly built glass tower, with gleaming revolving doors, a receptionist in a dark suit, shoes polished enough to reflect the ceiling lights. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to make an impression, but to study carefully the stage they had chosen. I wore my old jacket, the color faded, the cuffs slightly frayed. Straight-cut jeans, neat but not new. The leather shoes I brought had walked with me through many construction sites, clean but far from shiny. I knew exactly how I looked walking into that room, and I left it that way. Daniel and Laura arrived later with Mark. The three of them passed through the glass doors as if they belonged there. Mark went ahead, smiling at the receptionist, speaking quietly. Daniel followed, his hand resting lightly on Laura's back. They looked at me and nodded in a polite, distant greeting. We'll use the large conference room, Mark said, turning to me. It's brighter, easier to present. The door opened. A long conference table, black leather chairs, a wall-mounted screen. Mark pulled out the chair at the head of the table for Daniel. Laura sat beside him. When I approached, Mark gestured toward the far end near the door. You can sit here for convenience, he said, courteous but firm. I paused for a beat, then sat down. This chair was slightly lower. The screen was farther away. I looked at my position, then at them. No one adjusted anything. The roles had already been assigned, Mark began. Slides appeared, clean graphics, clear text. He spoke about cash flow, about potential, about reputable partners. Daniel nodded occasionally, adding a few comments, the voice of someone accustomed to the room. Laura flipped her notebook, taking notes like a manager. I sat still, hands on the table, listening. Every time Mark mentioned a number, I stored it away. Every time Daniel concluded on my behalf, I let it pass. As we discussed, Daniel said, turning to Mark, the deposit will go through this week to meet the timeline. Mark nodded. Everything is prepared. We just need the signature. Laura turned to me and smiled. Does that sound okay to you, Dad? I nodded slowly. It does. The short answer surprised Laura slightly. She had expected more questions. I didn't give her any. Mark continued, then moved on to procedures. Yes, he took out a stack of documents and placed them in front of Daniel, then Laura. When he passed them toward me, he set the stack slightly off to the edge of the table, like an unconscious habit. This is the reference copy, Mark said. The main version Daniel and Laura have already reviewed. I looked at the stack, then raised my eyes. Where is the main version? Mark hesitated for a beat. Daniel smiled and explained quickly. This one is enough for you. The other is the same. I picked up the papers and flipped through them slowly, letting my eyes linger on each page longer than necessary. I made the room wait. Mark stood by the screen, hands clasped in front of him. Daniel leaned back, projecting patience. Laura checked her watch. Any questions? Mark asked. Yes, I said. Whose name is the property under? Mark answered as rehearsed. The project entity. The name of the entity, I said. Mark read it. I nodded. Who is the authorized signatory? Mark looked at Daniel. Daniel answered. The partner. I closed the stack. The partner's name. The atmosphere shifted. Mark shifted his stance. Daniel leaned toward me. Dad, you're getting into technical details. I'm signing the money, I said. I'm asking details. Laura cut in, her voice soft but edged. You trust us. The phrase landed. Familiar. I looked straight at Laura. Trust doesn't replace paperwork? Mark cleared his throat. Mr. Hale, to save time. Whose time? I asked. A beat of silence. Daniel pressed his lips together, then stood and pulled a chair closer to me. Dad, let us handle this. You just sit and listen. As he spoke, he placed his hand lightly but deliberately on the back of my chair, a guiding gesture like steering someone who doesn't know the process. I shifted my chair just enough for his hand to slide off. I'm sitting fine. Laura turned to Mark with a polite smile. Dad is a bit tense. Tense? I repeated evenly. Or being seated. Mark flushed. I apologize if there was an oversight. I stood up. The room's attention snapped to me. I walked around, pulled out the chair in the middle of the table, and took that seat without asking or explaining. I set the papers down, adjusted the chair, and sat directly facing the screen. Now continue, I said. Daniel froze. Laura held her breath. Mark glanced toward the receptionist through the glass, then back. I opened the papers and pointed to a line. Where does this deposit go? Mark answered, his voice lower than before. Through which account? I asked. Mark named a bank. Whose account? I asked again. Daniel cut in. Dad! Whose account? I repeated. Mark said the company name. I nodded. This company was formed 6 months ago. Mark looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Laura. I want a copy of the Articles of Incorporation, I said, and a deposit agreement with a refund clause. Laura gave a tight smile. You're making everything complicated. I'm making everything clear, I replied. Mark exhaled. I'll send additional documents. Now, I said. The room went silent. No one moved. I looked at each of them, not angry, not raised in voice, just waiting. Daniel stood up and pulled Mark outside, speaking quietly. Through the glass, I saw them exchange rapid words. Laura stayed seated, looking at me, her smile gone. How far are you planning to take this? She asked. Until I know where my money goes, I answered. Mark returned with the laptop. We need more time. I have time, I said. You don't. I stood, gathered my papers. We'll stop here today. Daniel followed me into the hallway. You embarrassed us. I stopped and turned. Whose face? He didn't answer. I walked straight to the elevator. The doors closed. In the mirror, I saw myself unchanged. Worn jacket, old shoes, back straight. That day, they learned one thing. The stage they built was not for me to bow my head. It only helped me know exactly where to stand. And this was only the opening act. The second meeting took place at noon the following day. The same room, the same long table, leather chairs, white lights aligned neatly on the ceiling. But the atmosphere was different. The overt confidence was gone, replaced by caution masked behind professional smiles. Mark arrived earlier than usual. He stood by the window, looking down at the traffic below, as if he needed a few minutes to steady himself. Daniel and Laura walked in after me, speaking quietly to each other, then stopped when they saw that I was already seated in the middle of the table. Today I was still wearing the same old clothes. No change, no upgrade. I wanted them to understand that this had nothing to do with appearances. Mark placed a thick folder in front of me, clear plastic cover, the edges sealed with fresh tape. He slid it toward me with 2 fingers, more carefully than the day before. "This is the complete version," Mark said. "We've added the sections you requested." I looked at the folder. I didn't open it right away. I placed my hand lightly on the cover, feeling its thickness, then looked up. "Where do you expect me to sign?" Mark froze for a brief moment. Daniel gave a small laugh. "Dad, read it first." "I'm asking so I know what you're waiting for," I said. Mark pointed to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. "The signature goes here." I nodded and opened the folder. I didn't flip quickly. I read from the first page, line by line, paragraph by paragraph. Every time I came across legal terminology, I stopped and read it carefully. I heard Laura's pen tapping lightly against the tabletop. Daniel shifted his posture several times. The contract title was clear. Commercial Lease Agreement. The term was 10 years. The initial amount was labeled Tenant Improvement Contribution. Not rent, not a deposit. A tidy phrase, but one sufficient to take money from my hands without returning anything. I kept reading. On page 15, I stopped longer. My eyes fixed on a small section in dense print, placed between 2 major clauses. Assignment clause. That clause allowed them to transfer the lease to another party, collect money, while I remained the named guarantor. I read it again. Once more. Then a third time. The clause permitted the tenant to assign or sublease without the consent of the guarantor. I closed the folder. "Mark," I said. He looked up quickly. "Yes, sir." "Why does the lease allow unrestricted assignment?" I asked. Mark licked his lips. "That's a standard clause." "Standard for whom?" I asked. He looked at Daniel. Daniel answered, "Dad, these are technical things. Everyone uses them." "I didn't ask who," I said. "I asked why." Laura cut in, her voice softer. "Don't worry. It adds flexibility." "Flexibility for whom?" I asked. No one answered immediately. I opened the folder again and pointed directly at the paragraph. "If I put up the improvement money, you sign the lease, then assign it to another company, where does that money go?" Daniel exhaled. "You're overthinking this." "I'm reading," I said. "Those are 2 different things." Mark avoided my eyes. He adjusted his tie, then stared at his laptop as if searching for an answer there. "Mr. Hale," Mark said quietly, "in practice, this contract is structured for operational efficiency." "Efficiency for what operation?" I asked. He said nothing. I leaned back, letting the chair make a small sound. "Let me tell you something. I worked construction for 40 years. I've signed contracts in the rain on the hood of a truck. I know the smell of a clean deal, and I also know the smell of a trap." Daniel stood up. "You're taking this too far." "I'm taking it exactly far enough," I replied. I pointed to the clause again. "This section allows you to take my money, renovate the space, then assign it to someone else. I remain the guarantor, and you take the profit, correct?" Laura stood up abruptly. "No one said that." "I don't need anyone to say it," I replied. "The paper already did?" Mark wiped sweat from his forehead. "If you're uncomfortable, we can adjust it." "How?" I asked. He hesitated. "We'll need to discuss internally." "I'll wait," I said. Daniel looked at me, irritation now visible in his eyes. "Are you going to scrutinize every word?" "Yes," I said. Because every word here is my sweat. Laura lowered her voice. You're just making things tense. I'm not creating tension, I replied. I'm refusing to be blind. Mark closed his laptop. Give us 10 minutes. You have 10 minutes, I said. No more. They stood and stepped outside. Through the glass wall, I saw them talking quickly, hands gesturing. Mark nodded repeatedly. Daniel crossed his arms. Laura shook her head. I stayed seated, looking at the contract in front of me. I knew they had written it with one assumption, that I would sign without reading, trust my children's voices, and fear being labeled difficult. 10 minutes passed. They returned. Mark set the folder down, avoiding eye contact. We can revise the assignment clause, he said. How? I asked. Require your consent. Good, I said. Put it in writing. Daniel frowned. Do you really need to take it this far? I looked at my son. Did you really need to hide it this carefully? The question landed heavy and direct. Daniel turned away. Laura stayed silent. Mark took out a pen and made notes. His hand trembled slightly. That day I didn't sign. I stood up and gathered the papers. We'll meet again when the contract tells the truth, I said. I left the room, leaving the three of them standing still. For the first time, I saw that they understood something. This game only works when the person being led agrees to bow his head, and I was standing upright. The third meeting was arranged so quickly it was almost blatant. Mark called that same afternoon, his voice more urgent than usual. Daniel sent me a short message. Dad, come sign so we can finish this. Everything's been fixed. I replied just as briefly, I'll come. The office was the same. The conference table was still long. The leather chairs were still cold to the touch. But something had changed. No one pointed out a seat for me. No one tried to push me toward the end of the table. I sat right in the middle, naturally, as if it had always been my place. The revised contract was placed in front of me. Thicker cover, more sticky notes. Mark stood slightly off to the side, not blocking my view. Daniel and Laura sat across from me, back straight, hands close together. They looked like two people waiting for test results. We revised it per your request, Mark said. The assignment clause now requires your written consent. I nodded. Good. I opened the folder. This time I read faster, not because I trusted it, but because I knew what to look for. I scanned each section that had made me stop before. The wording had changed. Commas had shifted. The structure was the same, but the blade had been dulled. I flipped to the signature page. Mark placed the pen on the table and slid it toward me. It was a heavy metal pen, cool to the touch, the kind people use to create a sense of gravity. I picked it up. My fingers touched the barrel. A familiar feeling, very familiar. Daniel exhaled as if he had been holding his breath since I opened the folder. Laura leaned forward slightly. Mark stood still, hands clasped together. We just want to get this done, Daniel said softly, so things can settle. Settle. The word sounded gentle, but in my mind, it carried a different meaning. I lowered the pen tip to the paper. Ink touched the line, dark and clear. I began writing my name. The letter H, then the letter A. At that moment, my hand trembled. Not from weakness, not from fear. It was a very small vibration, just enough for me to feel it clearly, a misalignment between intention and body. The room went silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Daniel stared at my hand. Laura held her breath. Mark leaned in slightly as if trying to see how far I had written. I stopped. The pen hovered over the paper. A small drop of ink spread, forming a black dot in the middle of the signature line. Your hand, Laura began. I raised my other hand to signal stop. No raised voice. No explanation needed. I looked at the half-written name. I looked at that familiar name, the one that had signed hundreds of blueprints, thousands of invoices, countless documents over 40 years. I lifted the pen. The room seemed to freeze. Daniel sprang halfway to his feet. Dad? I placed the pen on the table, parallel to the edge of the folder, so precise it couldn't be mistaken for accident. I need more time, I said. Mark swallowed. Sir, everything has... I know, I cut in. But my hand just reminded me of something. Daniel frowned. You're worrying about nothing again. I'm worrying about myself, I replied. Laura tried to keep her voice steady. You've already read it. Every clause. I've read other things too, I said. Things that aren't on the paper. No one asked what those were. They were afraid of the answer. I stood up. I straightened the folder, stacked the pages back in order, and slid it toward Mark. We'll stop here, I said. When I'm ready, I'll call. Daniel stood up fully. You can't just change your mind like this. I looked at my son. His irritation was clear now, mixed with worry. For the first time, I saw that he wasn't sure he still controlled the situation. I haven't signed, I said, so I haven't changed my mind. Laura squeezed Daniel's hand. You're just dragging this out. I've lived my whole life, I replied. Dragging it out a few more days won't kill anyone. Mark said nothing more. He only nodded, avoiding my eyes. I walked to the door. When my hand touched the handle, I paused for a beat. There are moments, I said, without turning around, when a trembling hand isn't weakness. It's stopping a mistake in time. No one answered. I opened the door and left. Behind me, the room remained still, as if abandoned in time, and I knew that from the moment the pen stopped, the game had moved into another phase. The next meeting was moved down to the ground floor, the brokerage firm's secondary transaction office. Daniel said it was to make things less tense. I understood. They wanted a smaller space, fewer people, easier to control. I arrived on time. Mark was already standing near the reception desk, holding a thin folder. Daniel and Laura were seated at a round table by the glass window. They sat facing each other, and I was placed slightly off to the side, taking up only half the table. No one asked whether I wanted to change seats. We think it's better to keep this simple, Daniel began as soon as I sat down. Sign the lease part first to stay on schedule. Lease what? I asked. Daniel hesitated. The space. I turned to Mark. Which space? Mark replied quickly in the clearly rehearsed tone. The old warehouse property on the west side, as we discussed. I nodded. I remember. Mark slid the folder toward me. This is the lease agreement? I didn't touch it. I spoke slowly. Before reading, I want to clarify one thing. Daniel crossed his arms. Laura looked down at the tabletop. Who currently holds title to that property? I asked. Mark answered, the seller. The specific name, I said. Mark read out the legal entity. I nodded. Has the purchase agreement been signed? A preliminary agreement has, Mark replied. Has the money been transferred? I asked next. Mark looked at Daniel. Daniel was about to speak. I asked Mark, I cut in. Mark exhaled. The funds were transferred this morning. I nodded again. Good. I placed a confirmation document on the table. Proof that the purchase funds for the warehouse had been transferred from an account in my name into the seller's escrow that morning. This is the bank confirmation, I said evenly. The purchase funds were transferred in full this morning. The transfer order was signed by me, and the money went directly from my account. The room seemed to sag. Laura lifted her head, her expression visibly changing. Daniel stared down at the paper, eyes fixed on the bold number printed at the bottom corner, as if only now realizing this was no longer within his control. Mark went pale. You bought it already? I nodded. Yes. Daniel sprang to his feet. When did you buy it? Before coming here, I answered. Laura pressed her lips together. Why didn't you say so earlier? I'm saying it now, I replied. Mark flipped through the lease contract, his hands clumsy. But this lease... I placed my hand on the papers, stopping him. We came here to sign this, didn't we? Mark nodded reluctantly. Daniel looked at Laura. Laura looked at me. I pushed the folder back toward Mark. Then let me ask. I paused, looking at each of them. Why would I lease a property? I said clearly. That I just bought with my own money? No one answered. Mark opened his mouth and closed it again. Daniel stood frozen. Laura turned her face away. I'll ask again, I said. Can someone explain? Daniel took a step toward me. You're making this complicated. Complicated for whom? I asked. Laura spoke up, her voice tight. You're ruining the plan. Whose plan? I asked. Laura fell silent. Mark wiped his forehead. There may have been a procedural mix-up. Mix-ups usually benefit whom? I asked. No one answered. I stood up and pushed my chair back. You brought me here to sign a lease while the property is already in my name. You expected me to sign without asking. Daniel looked at me, his voice low. You don't trust us? I'm not doubting, I said. I'm cross-checking. Laura stood up abruptly. You're making us look like scammers. I looked straight at her. If a mirror makes you uncomfortable, the problem isn't the mirror. Mark gathered the papers. We should end this meeting. I agree, I said. Daniel looked at me, anger mixed with fear in his eyes. How far are you going to take this? Until everything is called by its proper name, I replied. I picked up my bag and turned away. Before leaving, I paused. Never hand me something and hope I won't read it, I said. I build houses by reading blueprints. I avoid traps the same way. I walked out, leaving behind a room frozen in place, not out of courtesy, but because the question I had just asked held them there, like a mirror set exactly where it belonged. The conversation seemed to have ended there. Mark gathered the files. Daniel stood in place as if calculating an exit. Strategy? Laura looked out through the glass door, deliberately avoiding my eyes. No one said anything more. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the kind that makes everyone want to leave as quickly as possible. I picked up my briefcase and walked toward the main door. My hand had just touched the handle when a soft click sounded from the side of the room. The secondary door, usually kept closed, was pushed open from the outside. A man stepped in. He was in his early 50s, salt and pepper hair, a neat build. His gray suit fit well, not flashy, but clearly tailored with care. He didn't look around or offer any polite greeting, his gaze fixed straight on me, as if he knew exactly who he was there to see. Sorry I'm late, he said, his voice low and clear. The parking lot was crowded. Mark spun around. You are... The man opened his briefcase, took out a lawyer's identification card, and placed it lightly on the table. I'm Ethan Brooks, he said, attorney for Mr. Hale. Daniel flinched. Laura turned fully around, her face going pale. Mark stood frozen, still gripping the stack of papers. I turned back toward Ethan. You came at the right time. Ethan nodded, then stepped forward one pace to stand beside me, neither pushing ahead nor stepping back, positioned just enough for everyone to understand that he was not a guest. I was asked to attend today's meeting, Ethan said, and to deliver a few documents. Mark swallowed. We have already concluded the meeting. Not quite, Ethan replied, at least not the legal part. He set his briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside was a neatly clipped stack of documents, with a dark blue hardcover. Ethan took out the top page and placed it in front of Mark. This is a notarized copy of the certificate of ownership, he said. The deed. Mark bent down. His eyes widened as he read the name listed as the transferee. Daniel stepped closer to look. Laura stood still, her hand gripping the edge of the table. The property at the West Warehouse District, Ethan continued, was officially transferred into Mr. Hale's name this morning. He took out another sheet and placed it on top. And this is the escrow receipt. The purchase funds have been held and dispersed according to procedure. The room seemed to lose all its air. Mark stepped back half a pace. Daniel stood motionless. Laura raised a hand to her mouth, then lowered it again, unable to speak. Ethan turned to Mark. I want to confirm that your firm has received these records, Mark stammered. We received notice. Good, Ethan said, because that means any further transactions related to this property require the direct consent of my client. Daniel turned toward me. Dad, you prepared this in advance? I looked at my son. I only did what I needed to do. Laura cut in, her voice tight. Why didn't we know? Ethan answered. For me. Because there was no obligation to inform you beforehand. Mark braced his hands on the table. But the lease contract no longer has any basis, Ethan interrupted. Mr. Hale is the owner. There is no lease relationship between the parties. Mark fell silent. Daniel stared at the documents. Laura stepped back, leaning against a chair. I took one step forward. You brought me here to sign a contract. I came, listened, asked questions, and answered in my own way. Daniel shook his head, looking down at the papers. You turned everything upside down. No, I said. I just put the truth where it belongs. Ethan gathered the documents, but did not put them away. He rested his hand on the folder, a reminder that everything was still open. From now on, he said, all communications regarding this property will go through me. Mark nodded stiffly. Daniel looked at me, his eyes a mix of confusion and anger. Laura said nothing, standing there as if she had just been pulled out of a carefully calculated dream. I turned and walked toward the main door again. This time, no one stopped me. Behind me, Ethan closed his briefcase, the latch clicking shut with a dry sound. Brief, but sharp enough to mark a boundary. The side door stood open, and with it, the entire game they had been building all this time had been exposed. The room had barely cooled before it filled with more people. Mark called the receptionist back in and asked her to bring the floor manager and 2 administrative staff members inside to confirm the records. Daniel seemed to think this was a face-saving procedure. I understood. This was when the lights came on. Ethan stood close to the table, opened his briefcase, and took out a set of documents, bearing an embossed seal. He placed each page down neatly where everyone could see. The sound of paper meeting the tabletop was dry and sharp, enough to draw attention. Before we conclude, Ethan said calmly, I need to read the ownership confirmation in front of witnesses. The floor manager nodded. The 2 administrative staff stood still, eyes fixed on the documents. Ethan read slowly, item by item, the property name, the address, the parcel number, then the final line. Legal owner, Robert Hale. The room held its breath. The receptionist near the door froze. The floor manager leaned forward to look more closely. Mark went pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Daniel stepped forward. Wait! Ethan raised a hand. I'm not finished. He turned the page. Escrow receipt. The full purchase amount was dispersed this morning. The transfer order was signed by Mr. Robert Hale. The source of funds has been verified as legitimate. Mark reached up to wipe his neck, his tie slipping out of place. One administrative staff member took notes, the pen moving faster than before. Daniel turned to me, his voice breaking out. Dad, what are you doing? Doing this in front of everyone? I looked straight at my son. I'm following proper procedure. Laura jumped up, her chair scraping loudly. Mark, this... Mark shook his head, speaking softly but clearly enough to hear. The file is complete. There's no way to revise it. Ethan gave a small nod to the floor manager. Can you confirm the owner's name in the system? The floor manager opened his computer and typed a few lines. A long beat of silence passed. Then he looked up. Yes, he said. The property is registered under Robert Hale. The confirmation fell like a hammer. Daniel lost control. That's impossible, Dad. You didn't say anything. I spoke through paperwork, I replied. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. You set us up. You built it first, I said. I just pulled back the curtain. Mark stepped back, leaning against the filing cabinet, his eyes avoiding everyone. The 2 administrative staff exchanged a glance, then continued writing. Ethan turned to Mark. From this point on, any lease agreements related to this property are invalid without my client's signature. Mark nodded, his throat dry. I understand. Daniel turned to Laura. You said everything was fine. Laura stiffened. You thought what? Daniel snapped. You said Dad would sign. The air broke apart. Voices overlapped. The floor manager spoke quietly. Please maintain order. I stood up. No need to raise my voice, just to stand in the right place. In front of everyone, I said, I confirm that this property belongs to me. All decisions from this point forward We'll follow the law and the proper signature. Ethan gathered the documents, leaving copies on the table. The witnesses are sufficient. Daniel breathed hard, eyes red. You've cut off all our options. I looked at my son. You chose that path. Mark bowed his head, murmuring an apology to the floor manager. The two administrative staff closed their notebooks, their expressions tightening. The stage had collapsed, not because of shouting, but because the truth had been called by its proper name in front of enough people. As I walked out the door, I heard behind me the scrape of chairs, the sound of sighs, fragments of whispered voices. The door closed. The lights in the room were still on, but the rolls had ended. The room, having just watched the stage collapse, fell into a different kind of silence, not the stunned quiet from before, but the heavier pause of people beginning to realize the story did not end with real estate. Ethan did not leave. He remained where he was, opened his briefcase again, and this time did not take out a thick file, but a single thin envelope, pale yellow. He placed it on the table, right beside the property ownership documents. Before everyone disperses, Ethan said, his voice even and clear, I need to clarify one matter related to the conservatorship petition, filed a few weeks ago. Daniel looked up. Laura turned sharply. Mark stood rigid. Ethan opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. This is a copy of the medical affidavit used to request an emergency conservatorship for Mr. Robert Hale. He rotated the page so the floor manager and the two administrative staff could see it. This document, Ethan continued, asserts that Mr. Hale suffers from diminished capacity and lacks the ability to manage his own financial affairs. Laura burst out. That was a doctor's conclusion. Ethan nodded. Yes, and that is precisely the problem. He flipped to the attached page. We contacted the hospital listed on this affidavit directly. The physician whose name appears here did not exist on that hospital's staff roster at the time. Mark swallowed hard. The floor manager frowned. One administrative staff member stopped writing and looked up. Daniel stammered. What do you mean? Ethan looked straight at him. I mean, this signature does not belong to a practicing physician at the facility cited. Laura took a step back. That's impossible. I'm not finished, Ethan said. The accompanying stamp is a scanned image, not an original ink seal. The signing date listed falls during the period when Mr. Hale was in cardiac recovery, having undergone no cognitive evaluation of any kind. The room froze. Mark reached for his neck, his tie now visibly crooked. The floor manager glanced toward the receptionist as if to confirm he had heard correctly. Ethan placed another document on the table. This is the independent medical opinion later ordered by the court. Its conclusion is entirely opposite. He paused, long enough for the weight to settle. Submitting a falsified medical affidavit, Ethan said, in order to seize control of an adult's assets, may constitute multiple criminal offenses. Daniel sprang to his feet. Dad, what are you doing? I looked at my son. I'm doing nothing. You acted first. Ethan continued, his tone unchanged. Specifically, falsification of medical records, providing false information to the court, and conspiracy to misappropriate assets. Laura's hands shook. What you're saying will destroy our lives. The law does not destroy lives, Ethan replied. It only names conduct accurately. Mark stammered. This needs to go to legal. Ethan nodded. Copies were sent to your legal department this morning? The floor manager cleared his throat. This meeting will need to be formally recorded. The two administrative staff bent over their notebooks, pens moving fast, louder than breathing. Daniel stood frozen, eyes red. We just wanted to manage things safely. I looked at my son and spoke slowly. Safe for whom? Laura opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left that fit. Ethan gathered the papers but did not put them away. He rested his hand on the envelope, as if sealing a conclusion. From this point forward, he said, all matters related to the conservatorship petition will be handled by the appropriate authorities. My client retains full authority over himself and his assets. No one responded. The room sank into a heavy silence. The kind where you can hear your own heartbeat. I stood up. This time, I said nothing more. There was no need. What they had tried to use to bind me had been placed under full light, and once that light is on, there is no way to turn it back off. The meeting ended in a way no one had anticipated. There were no more arguments, no more justifications, only documents resting where they belonged, and the people who once believed they held the advantage standing still, as if the rules of the game had been changed mid-play. Ethan suggested that everyone remain seated. This time the chairs were repositioned in a different order. Daniel and Laura sat across from me, close enough to hear every word clearly, not close enough to look away. "I will speak first," Ethan said calmly. "My client is prepared to withdraw the counterclaim and requests that the court dismiss the emergency conservatorship proceedings." Daniel looked up, a flash of hope crossing his face. Laura squeezed his hand, the tension unmistakable. "However," Ethan continued, resting his hand on the file, "that comes with conditions." The room went quiet. I looked straight at Daniel. "I will be clear," I said. I took out a single sheet I had prepared in advance, not thick, just enough to show that everything had been calculated. "First," I said, "the conservatorship petition must be withdrawn today, in writing, with confirmation from counsel and the court clerk. No delays." Daniel nodded too quickly, betraying his urgency. Laura pressed her lips together. "Second," I continued, "all of my personal and financial decision-making rights are fully restored, without conditions and without supervision." Ethan added, "This will be recorded in a written commitment." Daniel glanced at Laura. She nodded slightly. "Third," I said more slowly, "I will not file a criminal complaint at this time." Laura exhaled as if a heavy weight had been lifted. "At this time," I emphasized, meeting her eyes, "that right remains intact." Laura stiffened. Daniel opened his mouth to speak. "I'm not finished," I cut in evenly. "Fourth," I continued, "any contact regarding my assets, medical care, or legal matters must from now on go through my attorney. Family is still family. Procedure is procedure." Ethan nodded in agreement. Daniel lowered his voice. "Do you want us to sign something that cuts us off?" I shook my head. "I want boundaries. Clear boundaries." Laura straightened in her chair. "And the house?" "My property," I replied. "Rights of use will be reconsidered under a new, transparent agreement. Whoever stays does so in the correct role. Whoever signs does so with proper authority." Ethan placed another document on the table. "This is the draft withdrawal and non-refiling agreement, unless legitimate medical evidence approved by the court exists." Daniel skimmed it, his hand trembling slightly. "If we sign, you will keep this contained?" I looked at my son and spoke slowly. "I keep my word. I also keep my rights." The silence stretched. Laura whispered something. Daniel took a deep breath and picked up the pen. "Sign it," Laura said quietly. "This has gone too far." Daniel signed. Laura signed after him, her handwriting noticeably uneven. Ethan signed to confirm and gathered the documents. "These will be filed within business hours today." Daniel looked up, exhausted. "Dad, we did this because we were worried." I looked at him. "Who you worry for shows in how you act." Laura lowered her head. There were no excuses left. I stood up. This time, I did not rush. "I am withdrawing because I want to close this," I said. "I am keeping my rights because I have learned enough." Ethan opened the door. Hallway light poured in, clearer than before. "This ends here," I said. "The rest, each of us lives with our own choices." I walked out. Behind me, the papers were signed, power had shifted, and order was restored by signatures and clarity, and this time, everything stood exactly where it belonged. The consequences did not arrive with a single heavy blow. They came in pieces, steady and precise, like notices delivered to the right place, the right people, at the right time. No one shouted. No one made a scene. Everything simply shifted direction in silence. 3 days after the signing, I received confirmation from the court. The conservatorship petition had been withdrawn. The file closed. Ethan included a brief line, effective as of today. I read it, folded it, and set it aside. My part ended there. Theirs began. Daniel called me that evening. His voice was different, no longer firm, no longer sharp, just a fatigue that had been pressing down for too long. "Dad," he said. Property management called. "They gave us 30 days. 30 days for what?" I asked. "To move out," Daniel said. "The old lease is terminated. The new owner is not renewing." I knew who the new owner was. I did not say it. "Did you know?" Daniel asked. "From the moment you signed," I replied, "I knew." The line went quiet. I heard him exhale, long and heavy. The next day, Laura texted me, short, not angry, just a blunt question. "Why is my credit card locked?" I did not reply immediately. That evening I wrote back, "The guarantor account has ended. Everyone uses their own card now." She did not respond. I heard through acquaintances. The card declined at the grocery store. A transaction stalled at the gas station. A call to the bank that lasted more than 1 hour, ending with the same sentence. "We cannot find an active guarantor." Daniel started looking for additional work. Laura began reviewing expenses. Things once called conveniences suddenly became burdens. The new rent was higher. The security deposit was due immediately. Time did not wait. 1 week later, Daniel called again. This time his voice was lower. "Dad," he said, "Laura wants to move back to her mother's place for a while." "And you?" I asked. "She says she needs space." I heard him swallow. The next sentence came slowly, as if forced out of his throat. "We are talking to a family lawyer." I did not ask more. Some things, once spoken, move on by themselves. That afternoon, I stopped by the old garage. The Chevy from years ago was still there. The owner looked at me and nodded. "I kept my word," he said. "The car is untouched." I ran my hand lightly over the hood. The metal was cool beneath my palm. Some promises do not need paper. On the drive home, I thought about Daniel, about Laura, about the choices they made when they believed I was weak, exhausted, and in need of being managed. The consequences now were not punishment. They were the result of placing the wrong people in the wrong positions. That evening I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The phone lay face down. No vibration, no alerts. The house was quiet in a comfortable way. They were learning how to live with their decisions. I was learning how to live the rest of my life with boundaries clearly drawn. And between those two things, there was nothing left to negotiate. I returned to the garage on a gray morning. No appointment. Just the feeling that it was time to go back to that place. The place where everything had been held the right way when I was at my weakest. The garage sat tucked behind a row of old storefronts. The smell of engine oil mixed with the familiar scent of hot metal. The roll-up door was half open. I stepped inside, my shoes echoing on the worn concrete floor. The owner looked up from beneath a car. When he saw me, he wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. No surprise, no fuss. "You're doing all right now?" he asked. "I made it through," I said. "Thanks for keeping your word." He shrugged as if that were the natural order of things. A word is a word. The Chevy sat exactly where it had been, covered in a thin layer of dust. I placed my hand on the hood. The metal was cool. Everything was intact, from the straps to the small scratch at the corner of the front light. "I knew you needed cash back then," the garage owner said. "But that car, selling it in a rush, is a loss." "I didn't have a choice," I said. "You did," he replied calmly. "You chose to trust me." I looked at him. "You could have sold it." "I could have," he nodded. "But then I wouldn't sleep at night." He opened his ledger and flipped a few pages. "Storage fees are calculated by the exact days. No more, no less." I reached for my wallet. He waved me off. "Pay later. Look at the car first." I opened the door and sat in the driver's seat. The familiar smell of old leather rushed in. My hands settled on the steering wheel. The solid feeling returned, like reclaiming a piece that had been lost. He leaned against the doorframe, looking in. "While you were in the hospital," he said, "someone came and told me I needed to sell that car immediately." I turned to him. "Who?" "They said they were your children," he answered simply. "They said you weren't lucid anymore and told me to sell it fast to avoid legal risk." I said nothing. "I asked for paperwork," he continued. "They didn't have any. I told them if you woke up, I'd return the car. If not, I'd keep it until someone with proper authority showed up." I let out a slow breath. "Thank you." He shook his head. "I just did what was right." I paid the storage fee. He took it, wrote it into the ledger, tore off a receipt, and handed it to me. The handwriting was neat, not a single extra line. Before I left, I asked, "How did you know I'd come back?" He looked at me and smiled faintly, because people who keep their word come back to places where others keep theirs. I drove out of the garage. On the road, I thought about the signatures, the paperwork, the conditions that had once been laid out. Then I thought about a man who held on to a car based on a promise, while I lay between life and death. Some morals do not need the law to remind them. Some values require no certification. They stand firm in the moments when betrayal would be easiest. I turned onto a familiar street as the sun began to rise. The engine ran steadily. Everything moved in rhythm. And for the first time in a long while, I felt myself moving forward without needing to look back. I did nothing in haste. After the garage came ordinary days, breakfast on schedule, walks around the neighborhood, rereading old contracts. When everything had settled long enough, I called Ethan. "Prepare a lease for me," I said. "Rent is $1 per month." Ethan paused briefly. "Terms?" "Full NNN," I replied. "Taxes, insurance, maintenance, all operating costs borne by the tenant. Term is 12 months. Renewal, subject to review." "Who is the tenant?" Ethan asked. "A community organization I chose," I said. "Not family." Ethan understood immediately. "I'll keep it clean." 1 week later, we met at the West Side warehouse building itself. No conference room, no long table. Just an open space with daylight pouring in through high windows. The floor manager was present. The community organization's representative arrived on time. Daniel and Laura came a few minutes late. Daniel looked around, his voice awkward. "Why did you call us here?" "To witness," I said. Ethan placed the file on a temporary wooden table. "The lease is ready." Daniel frowned. "A lease?" Nodded. $1 a month," Laura blurted out. "To whom?" "A local vocational training organization," I replied. "They need space to train young tradespeople." Daniel looked at Ethan. "What do you mean by $1? "A nominal rate," Ethan said. "In exchange, the tenant assumes all NNN obligations. The owner bears no costs." Daniel turned to me. "You're giving it that cheap because I want to," I cut in. Ethan continued clearly. "The lease is effective upon signing. Keys will be handed over on site." The community representative stepped forward and signed, his handwriting decisive. Ethan signed to confirm. I signed last. $1 was placed on the table, the coin bright under the light. "Is that enough?" Daniel asked, his voice unsteady. "Enough," I said. I took the keyring from my coat pocket. I did not hand it to Daniel. I stepped past him and gave it directly to the representative, in front of everyone. "You keep it," I said. "Use it for the right purpose." The representative nodded, accepting the keys with both hands. Daniel stood frozen. "Dad, you're not leasing it to us?" "I am not," I said. "I do not hand assets to people who tried to take them while I was in the hospital." Laura burst into tears. "You're cruel." "I am fair," I replied. "I transfer property. I do not transfer control of my life." Ethan closed the file. "The handover record is complete." The floor manager signed to confirm, his eyes avoiding Daniel. Daniel stepped forward. "Do you still consider us family?" I looked at my son. "Family does not need paperwork. Assets need boundaries." I turned to the representative. Keys are delivered, responsibility as well. I walked out. Behind me there was a light metallic clink as the key ring was put away. A small sound, but enough to end every calculation. I had transferred the asset on my terms, and this time no blood tie was used as a condition. A year passed in a way very different from what I had once imagined. There were no family meetings, no long calls to repair anything. There was only time moving at its own rhythm, slow but unmistakable. The West Side warehouse is now lit every morning. The vocational training shop opens steadily from Monday through Friday. I stop by on an ordinary day, stand outside, and watch young people learning to cut steel, measure, weld, and join. The sound of machines runs steady, not loud, not showy. The organization's representative greets me and reports that the number of classes has doubled since the beginning. I nod. That is enough. Elsewhere, Daniel works at a suburban construction site. I hear through acquaintances that he started it as a laborer, hauling materials, cleaning up, doing work that leaves no room for long explanations. Laura went back to work as well, early shifts selling supplies at a building materials store. They no longer rent near the city center. They move farther out, cheaper, easier to manage. I do not track them. I only hear when information comes on its own. Once Daniel called me. His voice was hoarse, tired. "Dad, are you doing okay?" "I'm fine," I answered. He was silent for a few seconds. "We're trying." "If you're trying, then work," I said. "Don't explain." He wanted to say something else, then stopped. The call ended cleanly. Laura sent me a longer message, talking about difficulties, pressure, things she didn't understand before, ending with an apology. I read it all. I did not reply. Not out of resentment, but because some apologies arrive too late, and accepting them would blur boundaries built over an entire lifetime. My own place is different. I opened a small workshop beside the house, fixing cars, teaching a few sessions each week for those who genuinely want to learn the trade. No large sign. Customers come by word of mouth. The money is enough to live on. The time is enough to breathe. In the afternoons, I make coffee and sit on the porch. The Chevy is parked neatly. I run my hand over the steering wheel before putting the keys away, a habit that has returned. Everything around me operates on simple principles. Do the work right. Keep your word. Pay what is fair. I do not accept apologies. I do not demand remorse. I let each person carry their own share. That is not punishment. That is maturity. 1 year later, I did not defeat anyone. I simply reclaimed the right to live the way I choose. And that is enough to close every old chapter and open what remains with clean hands and a clear mind. I did not revise my will. I did not add a single new line. The legal documents finished their work long ago. They protected the assets, defined rights, and closed doors that had once been forced open by greed. But there are things paper cannot hold. In the morning, I open the workshop earlier than usual. The sun is still low, touching the cool concrete floor. I check the tools again, straighten what was knocked askew the day before. An apprentice arrives early and greets me with a firm nod. No need for many words. He understands what needs to be done. So do I. Some people ask why I still work when everything is settled. I answer simply, because I still want to show up. Show up on time. Show up when someone needs guidance. Show up to keep the rhythm in a place that without it would slowly fall out of step. Family, in the end, is not a title hung on a wall. Family is those who are present when needed and who stay when things are hard. I think about Daniel and Laura. I do not hope they return. I hope they stand steady where they are. If one day they appear, not to beg, not to claim credit, but to work alongside me, I will know. Then I will decide through action, not promises. At midday, I eat simply. A bowl of soup, a piece of bread. When I finish cleaning up, I lock the door and sit still for a few minutes before leaving. The silence there is not heavy. It is like the pause between two breaths, enough to realize you are living at the right pace. I once thought justice had to be loud, had to come with a gavel strike, with clear winners and losers. In the end, I understood that the most effective justice is the kind that puts everyone back in their proper place. Those who do wrong carry the consequences. Those who do right keep moving forward. No raised voices, no audience required. As evening falls, I turn off the workshop lights, lock the door, slip the keys into my pocket, and walk a short distance, breathing in the smell of wood and metal still clinging to my sleeves. Everything ends neatly, the way a day's work should close. My legacy is not in a safe. It is in the habit of keeping one's word, in standing in the right place when difficulty appears, and in staying calm before major choices. Whoever learns that carries it with them. Whoever does not, that is all right too. Life keeps moving, fair in its own way. I go home and close the door. The room is quiet. I sit down and let everything settle. No more words are needed. Silence is enough to finish. If you have walked with me all the way here, you probably understand one thing as well. The deepest pain is not losing money, but the moment you realize you have been pushed aside by the very people who once called you family. The justice in this story is not loud. It does not need shouting. It arrives at the right time, places everyone where they belong, and lets silence speak for itself. If you have ever been treated as a burden, managed like a problem to be handled, or forced to stand back up when no one reached for your hand, leave a dot and tell me where you are listening to this story from. And if you want to continue walking alongside stories where truth does not need to shout to stand upright, I sincerely appreciate a follow from you.